Hey, everybody, back again, getting ready to start a lecture over the Chapter 11 notes. With Chapter 11, we will be talking about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Now, where we left off in Chapter 10, excuse me, where we left off in Chapter 10, John Adams had been elected president in 1796 after George Washington announced that he would not be serving for a third term. And that set the stage very quickly for the competition between Adams and Thomas Jefferson, Washington's former Secretary of State. You have a situation where, under the rules at that point in history, Jefferson ended up finishing a very close second to Adams. So he becomes Adams' vice president. And then as we draw closer to the election of 1800, once again, Thomas Jefferson is going to run against the incumbent president, John Adams, who has been embattled basically his entire time in office. And he made an enemy of one of the strongest Federalists in Alexander Hamilton. But of course, by this point, Alexander Hamilton's political career is over. Aaron Burr is in a position to steal some Federalist votes from Adams. Plus, you also have to take into account that Thomas Jefferson, as the primary candidate of the Democratic Republicans, it was a very close race in 1796, and as we move into 1800, the Federalists have passed certain pieces of legislation like the Alien and Sedition Acts that were very unpopular with the American people, and that's going to give Jefferson, in addition to Burr also being a strong third candidate, it's going to give Jefferson, a lot of the ammunition that he needs going into a second bid to try to defeat President Adams. Now, by the time you get to 1800, like I said, Federalists had earned themselves a lot of enemies. The Alien and Sedition Acts were extremely unpopular. President Adams had opted against war with the French, a very unpopular move. Even though what you see in, say, World War II is we have a very, very fast buildup of the U.S. Navy. That's to prepare for wartime. At this point in history, because we didn't have the industrial output that we would end up having in the early to mid 20th century, by avoiding war with the British and a few years later with the French, one benefit is that it allows the American Navy, because we knew from 1792, 1793 that we needed to build a stronger Navy. By staying out of the war, that allowed us to focus on building up naval power. So that is one benefit, that the Navy had really started to build itself up. We still don't have any chance of competing with Great Britain for control of the seas, but we were at least able to build up a respectable Navy. President Adams is, in naval circles, a lot of times referred to as the father of the American Navy. The problem with this, while we did build our Navy up, it did look like he was wasting taxpayers' money. That's another thing that Thomas Jefferson could use against him, is that Adams pours money into building up the Navy during the 4 years of his president, and then he refuses to use it in war. So that just looks like bad spending. Alexander Hamilton, like I said, he had already shot himself in the foot politically to where he was never going to be president. But he also goes after Adams because Adams had insulted him. And Alexander Hamilton was the type of person that if you wronged him, he was going to do whatever he could to ruin you. So he ends up attacking Adams publicly. People start to look at it like, okay, if Alexander Hamilton had served under President Adams, served with Adams under Washington, was a Federalist, and he doesn't support President Adams, then, Adams already looks like a dead duck in terms of the election of 1800. When he prints this paper against Adams, that's something else that Jefferson's supporters are going to use to strengthen their argument. Look, the biggest name in the Federalist Party doesn't even support the Federalist president. Federalists fight back with a smear campaign against Jefferson, charging that he was the type of individual that would take money from a widow, that he had fathered mulatto or mixed children with one of his slaves, which actually turned out to be true, that he fathered several children with one of his slaves. And he was accused of being an atheist. He was not an atheist. He did not consider himself a Christian. He didn't really follow organized religions. To him, religion was more of a philosophical question, and he fell into a group of what they would refer to as deists. Deism was something that had popped up during the Age of Enlightenment in France, and of course, Jefferson, being the Francophile that he was, this was something. That's why he wasn't the biggest fan of organized religion, and he ended up looking at it more as a philosophical outlook. But he was not an atheist, as the Federalists claimed. Now, when the election of 1800 rolls around, Jefferson ends up winning the election with 73 electoral votes. John Adams only has 65. Adams got more popular votes than Jefferson did. Does that sound kind of familiar? History, they say, tends to repeat itself. We had the election of 2016 where Hillary Clinton ends up getting more popular votes than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump ended up getting more electoral votes. So, that just goes to show you that, things don't change all that much over the course of time. In a lot of cases, something comes up that you think, oh, that's never happened before. History is a big subject, and in a lot of cases, there's already been a precedent set. And that whole idea of a president losing the electoral vote but winning the popular vote, it happened in our third presidential election in 1800. Adams got more popular votes, but Jefferson won the state of New York, which carried a lot of electoral votes. That ends up giving him the election. Jefferson and Burr actually tied with 73 electoral votes. So Adams, the incumbent president, this should just show you how unpopular John Adams had become, is that he was the incumbent and he technically finished third because Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied with 73 electoral votes. Now, the second place finisher in a presidential election was supposed to serve as vice president. But the way that the electoral balloting was set up, again, he was supposed to be vice president, but it got him 73 electoral votes for president. Also, constitutionally, when you have a tie like this, or there's no clear-cut winner of a presidential race, the House of Representatives votes in the place of the American people because they were directly elected representatives of the American people, from the different states that they represented. The representatives decide, a hung election or a tied election. The House voted over 30 times. Federalists disliked Jefferson, so they voted for Burr as the lesser of two evils. You know, Alexander Hamilton and John Adams both knew that if Burr wins, that the Federalists would be blamed for Burr becoming president, and it would doom the Federalist Party. So Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, I'm sorry, I think I said Thomas Jefferson, but Hamilton and John Adams, even though they didn't like each other, they knew that Burr winning would be blamed on the Federalists. So they ended up using their influence to turn some of the Federalist votes towards Jefferson. When that ends up happening, that gives him the votes he needs. He ends up being selected as president of the United States. So everybody at this point right now, you still have people, with President Trump asking for recounts in states, people claiming voter fraud, which, it's still under investigation as to whether anything actually happened or not. People saying that the president's going to deny the results and he's going to refuse to leave office. Well, first of all, he can't really do that. Second, again, there are precedents. Things have happened in our country's past where, and it's actually very uncommon for the president to be decided the night of the election. It's just the way that our media is and plays on things and spins stories to get people all worked up. I mean, it usually takes 2 weeks at least and that's even without all these recounts. It usually takes 2 weeks until the final votes are tallied, or the final totals are tallied, I guess you would say. But there have been plenty of times where, well, not plenty, but there have been several times in our country's history where the House of Representatives has had to step in and decide a presidential election. Jefferson's election is referred to as the Revolution of 1800 for two big reasons. It was the first peaceful exchange of power between two political parties in a major nation. Usually when something like this happened, a civil war has taken place or a coup where you have one group overthrowing the group in power, at the upper level. A revolution would start at the base of the social pyramid. A coup takes place from the middle or from the top, replacing whoever's in charge. And those go violent very quickly. This was the first peaceful exchange of power. This does set a precedent for the Western world, that you have a changing of power between two different groups, two different parties, and it doesn't end in bloodshed. The Republicans had kind of framed themselves as the people's party, the common person's party. Through Jefferson, the American public, sort of, especially the working class, the poor, immigrants, they feel like through Thomas Jefferson that the people had entered the White House. Even though Jefferson was a wealthy landowner, he was a plantation owner, he was a slave owner, he was a wealthy, educated individual. But like I said, his party had positioned itself to say, we are the party of the masses. We represent the majority of the American people. Jefferson, while he had always been a fairly radical thinker, fairly liberal thinker among our founding fathers, the heading here, responsibility breeds moderation. Once he becomes president, he does see the need to not push for such radical ideas anymore. The inauguration was held in March of 1801, and Jefferson, coming in during this period of change of power, In his inaugural address, he stresses moderation between Republicans and Federalists, and leaning on what George Washington had urged years earlier. He outlined his foreign policy, saying, "Honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." Meaning that Jefferson's stance was, I'm going to try to be on good terms with all nations, and no, like President Washington had done before me, I don't intend to get involved in binding political alliances. He proved to be, very unconventional in terms of, even at this point, as our third president of the nation, certain things were expected of the president of the United States. And you can see that, some of these things apply even today. The way that a president dresses, the way that they're transported, the way that ceremony is carried out, in White House functions. Washington, Adams, they had money and they dressed the part when they appeared in public. Jefferson, on the other hand, was, I refer to him as a sloppy dresser. It was obvious that while he might own a plantation, he might own slaves, he didn't spend his money on fine clothes. It's not that he considered himself a common person, but at the same time, he didn't place a lot of importance on finery. So he'd rather spend his money elsewhere or save his money. So he looked shabby a lot of times. He rode around Washington on horseback like a common person would, as opposed to being transported in a carriage. This would be the equivalent of President Trump driving around in a Toyota, driving himself in a mid to high mileage vehicle that now, first of all, President Trump, we all know, would never do something like that. He would probably end up in a Rolls Royce or a Bentley, something like that, if he drove himself. But he wasn't attended by servants and driven around Washington in a carriage. He rode around Washington on horseback. Whenever, again, more of this president of the common man, he wanted to break the system that had already kind of fallen in place of more important people being seated closer to the president in meetings, in White House dinners, things like that. He liked to shake things up and have people seated randomly in different spots as opposed to the rank that they held. Also, he was mortified by speaking in public. He hated the idea of public speaking. So what he started doing, because again, President Washington had started the trend of State of the Union addresses, and whenever the president was supposed to report to Congress, he would deliver. Because Thomas Jefferson could write. He was a very eloquent writer, but he was not a good public speaker. He didn't like public speaking. So what he would do is he would write out, a speech. He would write out his report to Congress. And then he would send a clerk, he would send an office worker to deliver that message to be read, or someone to read it in front of the members of Congress. Now, when I say that there were two Jeffersons, it means that, two sides to his personality. He was the intellectual, the scholarly philosopher, a strong student of the French Age of Enlightenment, but also the practical politician that, while he might have argued with Alexander Hamilton to his last breath, Jefferson also knew that, there were some political ideas that he had that wouldn't necessarily function properly in the real world. Uh, and part of that came from experience serving as Secretary of State, then Vice President, and now President of the United States, that sometimes political theories don't always work as intended in real life. Uh, he resisted his party's call to get rid of all Federalists. So, you see there, while he might have been very left, very liberal, uh, Washington's moderate attitude did play some role on Jefferson. He feels that if the president comes in and just gets rid of everybody, every office holder, every appointee that is of a differing political party, it's going to cause problems in Washington and how the government functions. He thought it'd be counterproductive for a president to come in and undo everything that the previous president had done, even if he disagrees with it. Because even if the person that holds, this appointment, he might be very good at his job, even though politically we differ in the way that we look at things. So he looked at it more of an issue of, is it, if I'm going to make a change, is it the right thing for the American government, the American people? Can that person do their job well? Can we work together? Now, that's not to say that he just left everything as it was. He did come in and he did start changing some Federalist policies. One of the things that he did is he got rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts. He pardoned anybody that had been convicted under the Sedition Act in the past 2 years. He got the residency requirement to become a citizen reduced back to 5 years. Remember, talked about in the previous chapter, the Alien Act had created a situation where immigrants coming into the country, you became an American citizen after 5 years. Well, the Alien Act changed it from 5 years to 14 years. Well, after Jefferson gets in office, he works with Congress and he gets it reduced, the naturalization period reduced back to 5 years. And he also removed Alexander Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey, what had led to the Whiskey Rebellion. The big drawback here for the American government is it accomplished what Alexander Hamilton tried to do. Hamilton was trying to raise revenue for the American government, and the whiskey tax created about $1 million for the U.S. government on an annual basis. By removing this excise tax, that reduces the amount of revenue coming in that the government has to use to pay off debts to run the government. His Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, he was actually very, very good at his job. He was very capable in terms of creating a budget that the government could work on, even though it's, this would be like somebody creating a family budget and then losing their job or having their pay reduced and still being able to create a new budget with less money and still be able to get the job done. Despite having less income, losing out on $1 million of tax revenue a year, he still managed to balance the budget, reduce the debt while he served as Secretary of the Treasury. Outside of the excise tax on whiskey, most of the rest of Alexander Hamilton's programs were left untouched by Jefferson, even though when Hamilton was working to get them implemented and passed by Congress, Jefferson fought them tooth and nail. Because, again, that moderation. Now that he's president, he sees that quite a few, even though he did not like that whiskey tax, he saw that the things like the National Bank and things along those lines, Hamilton had been right about a lot of his economic theories. He also showed, and this is something that I wish people today would realize more. Again, I blame a lot of it on the media, but I'm not here to, give my political 2 cents. I'm here to lecture over stuff in our textbook. Jefferson taking a more moderate approach after being a very leftist liberal before he becomes president, shows that one party's loss didn't mean that our government was going to fall apart, because going into the election of 1800 and then that time period between 1800, November of 1800 and March of 1801, there were people, this like Chicken Little, the sky is falling, that the Democratic Republicans are going to come in and our government's going to fall apart, because it had been run by Federalists up to that point. Again, you watch any news, and that's the way that, no matter whether you support Republicans or Democrats, depending on what news channel you listen to, they both try to spin it that way. If Republicans are in power and then the Democrats start gaining offices, well, the conservative media outlets are going to, forecast doom and gloom. The country's going to fall apart, and vice versa. If Democrats control and Republicans start to gain seats in the Senate, in the House, the White House, then more liberal media outlets start saying, the sky is falling. This also helped solidify a two-party system in the United States, which now, even then, but now more so, it is more and more rare for a nation to have a two-party system. Most European nations have multi-party systems where you might have 7 people running for one seat in Parliament, and those 7 people could represent 4 or 5 different political parties. Now, while the Democratic Republicans had gained control of the White House, had gained seats in Congress, the Federalists had solidified, even if they lost control of the executive branch, even if they lost some influence in the legislative branch, they controlled the judicial branch still. In the Judiciary Act of 1801, which was passed before Adams left office, it created 16 new federal court districts. Well, new federal court districts are established. It means that you need to have a judge to preside over each district. So literally into the last hours, the middle of the night, before he is to leave office and Thomas Jefferson would become president, John Adams is writing, letters assigning Federalist judges to those court districts. These are referred to as the midnight judges because they were literally appointed in the middle of the night, the last day that Adams is president of the United States. This is a term that you also hear, nowadays referred to as court packing. In a case where Joe Biden has won the election of 2020, there are talks of court packing by both sides, that if the slots aren't filled by President Trump before he leaves office, if there are court slots, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's just district court positions on the federal level, if the Republican, if President Trump doesn't fill them before he leaves office, then the Democrats are going to get, liberal judges on those courts. Who knows when this video, how far down the road this video is going to be looked at, but one of the issues we dealt with is when President Obama was getting ready to leave office in, 2016, early 2017, a Supreme Court seat came up, and Republicans in Congress fought to keep an Obama appointment from filling that seat because that would have been a more liberal justice. And then when you had Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she passed away, in the later months of 2020. You've got a situation where Trump and Republican senators, they pushed to get, a Republican, a conservative appointment filling that spot before the election, before President Trump. If he lost, then at least that way there would be a conservative advantage on the Supreme Court. So again, this is nothing new. It's just the way that the political game is played. John Adams was doing it in 1801. President Trump's doing it in 2020. The goal is to pack the federal courts with Federalist judges that serve for life. That's the big deal. Whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's just a federal court position, justices, once they're approved, they serve for life. That maintains a Federalist influence, even if the Democratic Republicans end up gaining control of the executive branch and the legislative branch. Chief Justice John Marshall ended up proving a strong and very lasting support. He was Chief Justice for quite a while. The first major Supreme Court case in the country's history ends up being Marbury versus Madison back in 1803. This was the case that established the power of judicial review, where the Supreme Court can step in and decide the constitutionality of a law, to keep that law intact or to strike it down as unconstitutional. A judge, Marbury, ends up suing Secretary of State James Madison for not being appointed to the bench. Then, when with his lawsuit, because Secretary of State, shouldn't have been making that appointment, what happens is Marbury appeals to the Supreme Court, and because the conservatives on the Supreme Court ended up siding with Marbury, he does end up getting that bench appointment. Again, this is the first time the Supreme Court ever used their power to strike down something as unconstitutional, and it establishes the precedent of judicial review. That is a very important thing, and it's going to come up several times in the next few years that we'll talk about in this chapter. But again, it ends up being a precedent that's set that applies even to this day. And it's all part of the system of checks and balances to keep all three branches of our government working together. Jefferson was not a fan of getting involved in wars. He didn't like the idea of large standing armies, because his mindset was that if a government, especially with him being the president, the commander-in-chief of our military forces, he was afraid, even himself, that having a large standing army, that army as a, saying the army is a weapon, could be used against the people of a country, in the United States in this case. He preferred the idea, a more revolutionary era idea of militias, of reserves. He didn't like the idea of having a standing professional army. He preferred soldiers that were called to duty when needed. The problem with that is that they're not going to get paid. Therefore, they're not going to get paid when they haven't been called in the service. Therefore, they're not professional soldiers. They're citizens, and I can understand this argument, but if you have a standing professional army, their job is to soldier. With a militia, it would be like people in the National Guard or in the reserves. You have a day-to-day job, and when you are called on, then you serve. But it might not be your primary role in life. I'm not saying that the National Guard or the Army Reserves don't play a very important role. It's just there is a difference between people who day in and day out, that's their job, and being called in when the need arises. He downsized our army, and this is going to be something that the American military deals with from this point all the way up until the Civil War. This is going to be something that affects our military for decades to come. He downsizes the Army to only 2,500 standing soldiers, and he reduces our Navy, which had just been built up over the previous 4 to 6 years. He reduces our Navy to almost nothing. He puts us in a position where the United States, that's how we're going to avoid war. We don't have an Army or a Navy to fight with. As soon as he starts reducing, scuttling ships, mothballing them, however you want to refer to it, we start to run into issues that kind of change Jefferson's mind. That's another thing. If this had been under the tenure of Adams or Washington, Jefferson would have railed against a standing Army or a standing Navy. But now that he's the president and he's the one that's going to take the heat for any bad things that happen, he starts to reduce the size of the Navy. And as we're starting to set up trade contacts with other nations, the countries that we owed millions of dollars to, they're kind of reluctant to trade with us. So we had to find new trade partners, to try to help grow our country's economy, especially since the whiskey excise tax had been, removed, and we lost a lot of government income there. Pirates along the North African coast, which we had to pass, very close to Northwest Africa to get into the Mediterranean Sea to try to set up trade with the Italian city-states, small Italian kingdoms like the Kingdom of Naples, the island of Sicily, whether we're talking about the city-state of Venice or Florence or any other Mediterranean communities. The pirates of the Barbary Coast, or the Barbary pirates, they are attacking American ships left and right. And at the time, the Navy had been restructured. We didn't have the means to protect these merchant vessels from these pirate ships. Federalists, since we didn't have a means to fight them, we tried to pay the pirates off, basically paying them not to seize our ships, to imprison sailors. It was embarrassing, but it worked for a little while. But eventually, as time goes on, the money that's demanded is going to go up higher and higher. In Tripoli, which would be in Libya today, the Pasha cut down the American consulate, which would be like the American embassy. He cut down the American consulate's flagpole in a sign of warfare. Finally, the president, who considered himself to a degree a pacifist, had had enough. Jefferson ended up sending the Navy, and this is something that to this day is still part of the Marine Corps' hymn. From the halls of Montezuma, Central America, to the shores of Tripoli. Because while the Navy is a sea-based fighting arm of the armed forces, the Marine Corps at this point in history was not a separate branch. The Marine Corps was actually part of the U.S. Navy. Essentially, the way that it was looked at, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army were two branches at this point. Well, the Army fought land-based wars. If there was a military conflict that involved water, the Navy was involved there. But if the Navy was involved in a military conflict and land-based fighting was a result of that conflict, the Marines, mariners, the Marines were the land-based fighting group that was under the control of the Navy. As time goes on, the U.S. military ends up taking care of business. They end up signing a peace treaty with the Pasha of Tripoli. the government did pay $60,000 to free, in ransom to free American prisoners. But after that point, the pirates of the Barbary Coast ceased to be a threat. The Louisiana Purchase, I want to talk about it really quick. In 1800, Napoleon ended up getting Napoleon Bonaparte ends up becoming first consul of France, and he's well on his way to becoming emperor of France. Napoleon got the King of Spain to hand the Louisiana Territory back to France. Remember, the Louisiana Territory had belonged to France up until the end of the French and Indian War. After the French and Indian War comes to an end, it belonged to Spain. Now, 1800, we're talking 37 years after the French and Indian War had come to an end, Napoleon, out of fear, out of a strange alliance after he comes to power very quickly anyway, he ends up getting the King of Spain to give the Louisiana Territory back to France. Napoleon had no use for this territory. It's a very good plan by Napoleon, and in this class or in my European history class, it takes a lot for me to say anything good about the French. But Napoleon does this simply as a way to generate revenue for his plans as as the leader of the French government. He knew he was going to end up having to fight a very expensive war. His plan was to create a French empire that, controlled all of Europe. You need money to fight wars. Well, how do governments generate money? By creating taxes, by raising existing taxes. Napoleon didn't want to do that because Napoleon was very popular with the French people. If he starts taxing the French people, then very quickly he'll become unpopular. So if he can find a way to generate a lot of revenue so he has money set aside to fight his wars, then he's not going to have to tax the French people, which they'll like, because Napoleon was a military genius. And, he has a very, for most instances, he has a very well thought out plan for how he's going to carry out this expansion through Europe. He just needs money. He can't do the taxes. So with the Louisiana Territory, as soon as it's handed over to France from Spain, he kind of sends feelers out and says, because through Thomas Jefferson, there were still connections to the French government, especially the post-revolution government. And Napoleon puts word out there that, he's trying to fix the problems of post-revolution France. He doesn't really have any use for this territory in North America. He would be willing to listen to offers. So Jefferson ends up sending Robert Livingston to France to try to make a deal to buy what we needed. We needed to make sure that we secured control of the Mississippi River for transportation and the port of New Orleans. So he authorized Livingston to spend up to, or he talked to Congress and got Congress to approve the expenditure of $10 million for a small piece of Louisiana that included New Orleans, to give us access all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, when Livingston goes over to make that pitch, Napoleon, and of course he probably wasn't talking directly to Napoleon, but Napoleon goes, I understand, but, and any of you all that are collectors, like, Magic the Gathering cards or baseball cards or whatever, he's like, okay, I understand. You want to give me $10 million for this little piece of land. You want to give me so much money for this special card out of this set. But if I sell you that card, it breaks up the set and the rest of those cards are worthless. I tell you what, I'm going to cut you a deal here. You're willing to give me $10 million for the port of New Orleans. For $15 million, I'll give you the entire Louisiana territory. It literally came down to being pennies per acre. This was actually a huge deal, but it creates a burst of $15 million of revenue that Napoleon will be able to use for his future wars that he doesn't have to tax the French people for. And we get a potential rival / enemy out of our backyard, and we more than double the size of the United States if this sale goes through. Now, the problem that President Jefferson runs into, the delegates had only been authorized by Congress to spend $10 million. Jefferson had always been a strict interpreter of the Constitution. According to the Constitution, the president didn't have the authority to approve expenditures like that. That had to come from Congress. But you don't know how long that this deal is going to be available. So Jefferson says, you know what? He says, tell them you buy it. Go ahead, sign the deal. I'll get the other $5 million. Because again, you look at this map here. This is the United States. We were going to pay $10 million for this little piece right here. And for $5 million more dollars, Napoleon was willing to sell all of this. Now, of course, because Jefferson takes a more elastic or loose interpretation of the Constitution, the Federalists flip-flop as well. And where Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists had a very loose interpretation in the beginning of the Constitution, now they take a strict interpretation. It's exactly what Washington warned against. It's partisan politics. When one party says one thing, the other party opposes it just because it was this party's idea, even if it's not a bad idea. Again, do you see anything like that in our government today? Federalists didn't want the new land because new land meant new settlers. That meant new states. That meant more farmers, ultimately more Democratic Republican voters. Also, simply because it was Thomas Jefferson's idea, his brainchild. Now, we end up making the purchase. Like I said, the price was roughly 3 cents an acre, $15 million for all of this land. Again, this does increase his reputation as being a man of the people, because it, like I said, it pretty much doubles the size of the United States, and it will be farmland, it will be frontier. So those farmers, those common folk that were supporters of the Democratic Republicans, it looks like, he did this to help them, because now anybody in the United States that would ever possibly want land, they could have it, and they could have as much as they want. The problem is that even though this had belonged to the French, it had belonged to the Spanish, went back to the French, and now it belonged to us. This area, what is now the American Midwest, it was relatively unexplored by all of these groups. President Jefferson ends up sending Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their famous expedition, and they traveled from St. Louis up the Missouri River. Then they hike over the Rocky Mountains. They travel down the Snake and Columbia rivers. They finally make it to the Pacific Ocean. Along the way, they did survey, they did map the Louisiana Territory. They had managed to befriend Native Americans on their travels. They took notes about different things they saw in terms of plant life, in terms of wildlife, the lay of the land. Again, like I said, they did some surveying, but just generally what the land was like. Some places, it's open plains. Got the Rocky Mountains, so you have the greatest mountain chain in North America, different things like that. And once you get over the Rocky Mountains, then you have a much shorter distance to travel, and you finally hit the Pacific Ocean. Of course, we knew the Pacific Ocean was there by that point, but nobody had really trekked all the way across North America at this point, at least in modern recorded history. After Lewis and Clark, you start to see other explorers going farther out west, but it's still going to be a few decades before you see a heavy push to populate the Louisiana Territory. Zebulon Pike ends up exploring Spanish-held territory in what is the American Southwest, and which would eventually be part of the United States. But at this point, it was controlled by the Spanish. He explored Colorado, New Mexico, parts of Mexico, and also the state that would become Texas. Now, Aaron Burr had served as vice president in President Jefferson's first term. For Jefferson's second term, Burr was out. Jefferson did not like having Aaron Burr as his president in the first place. After he replaced Burr in the second term, then you end up with a situation where Burr was disgruntled because President Jefferson, and again, if you've ever watched Hamilton, after the election of 1800, there's a scene where Madison and Jefferson are talking, and Burr comes up to congratulate Jefferson on a race well run. He said, "I'm looking forward to working with you." And Jefferson says, "What? You openly campaigned against me, and now you're talking about being vice president?" Of course, Jefferson knew the vice president becomes, or the person that finishes second in an election becomes your vice president. But what happens is that he gets it changed where after this election, the president names his vice president. So in the second term, Jefferson wins, he replaces Burr. Being a disgruntled former government employee, Burr gets into a couple of questionable schemes. The first situation that arises was in New York and New England, which was Federalist territory. He tried to create a revolution to break New York and the New England states away from the rest of the country. Alexander Hamilton, who was no friend of Burr's, ends up revealing this plan to Jefferson, the President of the United States. And as a result of that, Aaron Burr ends up challenging Hamilton to a duel. Hamilton reluctantly accepts, and as a result, he ends up, in a lot of cases, you hear about duels. In a lot of cases, duels didn't have to be to the death. Burr could have shot Hamilton in the leg, the arm, whatever the case is. One other thing, this was just a matter of honor, and something that is addressed in the Hamilton musical as well. One thing that a person could do is they could raise their firearm in the air, fire, and then technically they're defenseless because it was a flintlock pistol that had one shot. If the other man was a man of honor, he couldn't shoot a defenseless person. That person that fires their gun in the air would basically be, in terms of an argument, would be basically be conceding the point. You're right, I was wrong. But if somebody does that, the person that still has a loaded weapon, they get to make the choice of whether they're going to take their time and shoot this person, or whether they're going to fire their gun in the air as well and basically say, okay, this is squashed. Burr didn't do that. Hamilton, that's something that he talked about doing, but Burr ended up shooting Hamilton and killing him as a result of the duel. After that occurred, Burr's political career is over with. He moves out west. That leads to scheme number 2. There, he's looking to carve off a separate nation in the West. Once he creates a new nation, Then he's going to invade Spanish territory to increase the size of his new nation. As a result of this, because he, again, is trying to basically start a revolution to break American territory away from the United States of America, Jefferson ends up having Burr arrested and charged him with treason. Burr was found not guilty due to a lack of witnesses or anybody that would testify against him, but this had all been in the news. You know, you've got the duel where he could have spared Alexander Hamilton's life. You have the scandal of trying to break New York and New England away from the United States, and now moving out west and trying to break Western territory away from the nation. His name was ruined. So, you know, he was disgraced. You don't hear anything about Aaron Burr really after this point. Now, what this does show is that, you know, even though the United States has been a functioning nation and government now for close to 20 years, there's nothing easy about it. They're going to continue to go through growing pains for quite some time. 1803, Napoleon ends up starting his war against the rest of Europe. For America, this ended up working out for us financially. We could trade with either side in the war, sell them supplies, and make money from both sides. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, that ensured that the British ruled the seas, and it ended the U.S. free reign of the open seas, because now if we were trying to transport goods to sell to the French or French allies, the British Navy was going to stop us. We could still continue to trade with the British, but it cuts our business in half. At the Battle of Austerlitz, that ensured that France controlled most of the land in Western Europe, but the British Navy was strong enough to cut the seas off from the French Navy. 1806, London issued the Orders in Council. These rules state that any foreign nation, even though it didn't specifically state the United States, it was directed at us. Any foreign ship headed to France must first check in at a British port for inspection to make sure that we're not dealing in war materials. Likewise, the French Navy, they had ships that would stop any ships from entering British ports. So now we've got situations where American naval vessels, or not American naval vessels, American merchant vessels, civilian vessels, they could be stopped by the British or the French, and we might have American sailors that are impressed by either side. Roughly 6,000 American sailors end up being impressed. Most, if not almost all of those, end up being impressed by the British. Then in 1807, you have the Leopard, a British naval vessel, attacking the U.S. Chesapeake. The British government apologized, but again, there's still that feeling that, you know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we fought a war of independence against the British. In a lot of people, especially the older generation, they might not like the French, but they grew up with British being the bad guys. There was a big push for America to go to war because Jefferson did not like the concept, and it would have been a bad idea to go to war with Great Britain. Again, our military, our army, our navy wasn't, you know, they were not in a position to go to war with one of the most powerful countries in the world, not just Europe. Especially fighting over a 3,000-mile wide body of water against the strongest navy in the world. So Jefferson, even though he was enraged when Washington wouldn't go to war with Great Britain again, Thomas Jefferson, a very practical politician, but he's also a flip-flopper, which makes you look really bad in the political arena, even though pretty much all politicians flip-flop. Where Jefferson had pushed for war with Great Britain years earlier when he was Secretary of State, now he's President of the United States. everything would fall on him. He's already reduced the size of our military, so he's not anxious to get involved in a war with Great Britain. And it's one of those things where if he moves too far away from conflict with one nation, it's almost pushing him to side with the other nation. And if he pulls away from that nation, it could lead to war with nation B and push him towards nation A. He felt the only way to avoid war with England or France would be to impose an embargo, stop exporting, stop trade altogether with England and France. That's the big problem, is that, and again, you can't single out England or France. So in 1807, the Embargo Act is passed, and it forbid exports to any nation. This cripples our manufacturing sector. We hadn't gone through an industrial revolution yet, but all of the manufacturing, all the industry was in the north. So New England was hit really hard by the Embargo Act. And it didn't just hurt the factories, it didn't just hurt manufacturing, it also hurt the shipping industry because there was nothing to ship anywhere. So ships basically sat dormant in harbors, merchants went broke, factory owners were losing money. The South and West end up being hurt as well, but to a lesser degree. Because of the Embargo Act, smuggling, of course, goes on the rise, and they're running risk, therefore prices go up. It hurts the American people because while we have smugglers that are sneaking goods out of the country, imports are being snuck in as well. So those foreign imports that are getting goods that we can't produce ourselves because we don't have the means or factories have shut down, prices go up, and it hurts the common people that Jefferson's supposed to champion. 1809, Congress repeals the Embargo Act and passes the Non-Intercourse Act. It's not what you think it's about, you dirty-minded little monkeys, because I know a couple of you out there that are actually watching the video are snickering about it. The Non-Intercourse Act outlawed shipping to England and France only. This will allow us, theoretically, to trade with the Germans, to trade with the Spanish, to trade with the Dutch, the Russians, Scandinavians, the Italians. It makes sense on paper, but England is our #1 trading partner. France is our #2 trading partner. They make up the bulk of our export goods. All those other nations honestly conducted very little trade with us. The embargo did have some unexpected benefits. It forced American industry to grow. Again, it doesn't quite push us into an industrial revolution, but it forces our industry to grow to a point because we had to be able to produce these goods that we couldn't buy from foreign producers anymore. It starts inadvertently. Jefferson does something that causes Alexander Hamilton's vision of an industrialized America, moving away from an agrarian, rural farming society to an industrial society. It starts to get, that vision starts to take shape. Now, the election of 1808, James Madison ends up following Thomas Jefferson to the presidency. Madison was when I say he was small, bookish, and like Jefferson, a poor speaker, when I say small, I would have to go back and look it up, but I want to say for some reason that James Madison was only like 5'4", 5'5". He was a wee man. And he was also in relatively poor health. The embargo was clearly unsuccessful, so Madison comes up with what is referred to as Macon's Bill number 2. It proposed to allow trade with other nations, but also to exclusively reinstate trade with England or France, whichever one pledged to drop its trade restrictions. So this is kind of a first come, first serve. We'll trade with other nations, but we'll reopen trade with whichever one of you all is willing to work with us. Whoever's going to give us the better deal. Napoleon jumped on this opportunity and promised to drop restrictions and open trade with the U.S. His plan was essentially meant to turn us against England. And it also gives him the opportunity to stab us in the back if it ever becomes convenient. I'm not saying Napoleon was a good person. He was a great strategist, and he was very shrewd. I'll put it that way. Madison could tell that Napoleon was up to something, but he was trapped in his own proposal already. I think Madison was kind of leaning towards Great Britain accepting this because, again, they were our #1 trade partner. He doesn't trust Napoleon. He knows that Napoleon has to have an ulterior motive here, but he had already made the offer. Napoleon accepted the deal, so reluctantly he goes along with France. This is not going to sit well with the British. By the time you get to 1811, Congress was a different animal than it had been prior to this point. The younger generation, now our founding fathers were the older generation. Younger men from the West and South, they had ousted the old guard. Even outside of conservative versus liberal, what the country looked like at this point was the old guard was on the coast in the original 13 colonies. The new wave was coming from out west and down south. The war hawks, as they were called, because they pushed for war, these foreign entanglements that Washington, Adams, and Jefferson had all tried to avoid. Kentucky's own Henry Clay was a very vocal war hawk, and he was named to the Speaker of the House of Representatives by the age of 34. The war hawks wanted not just if there was a foreign nation that tangled with us, the war hawks also wanted Native Americans cleared out of the Ohio Valley so Americans could safely move west and settle in the frontier without fear. Of course, white settlement west of the Appalachians is opposed by Shawnee leaders who happen to be brothers, Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, as he was referred to by Americans. You have a situation where Tecumseh and the Prophet, when I say they encourage traditional Indian clothes and culture, they urge Native Americans not to assimilate with the Americans, not to give up or sell their land, that they should fight for what belongs to them, what belonged to their ancestors, fight against the encroachment of European settlers. And they organized a coalition of various tribes to oppose the American advancement. November of 1811, the Indian governor, William Henry Harrison, ends up attacking and defeating the Shawnee at the Battle of Tippecanoe. In this battle, Tecumseh's brother, the Prophet, ends up being killed. William Henry Harrison becomes a national hero. It earns him the nickname of Old Tippecanoe, and just like President Washington and several other presidents after them, William Henry Harrison will eventually turn this national popularity, celebrity status into political votes in the future. William Henry Harrison will eventually become president of the United States. And also because the American government was responsible for the death of the Prophet, Tecumseh ends up turning into a British ally. Of course, Great Britain still has Canada as a colony, so that could be a potential problem down the road. By the time we get to 1812, war with the British, because the British are upset that we have established a trade connection with France. The Native Americans under, the Shawnee Coalition under Tecumseh, they've now allied with the British. And it's like the combination of our two greatest, most prevalent enemies at the time. June of 1812, President Madison asked Congress to declare war on England. And at this point, because the War Hawks had gained more support in Congress, they voted to do just that. Now, why did we go to war with England in 1812? Three main reasons. Freedom of the seas. We wanted the right to sail the open seas unimpeded. We wanted to be able to trade with whoever we wanted without fear of our ships being stopped, our sailors being impressed into service in the British Navy. We went to war because of the possibility of gaining more land. We fight with the British. We've already beat them once. Never mind the fact that we had to have the French to help us. But we fought the British once. We beat them then. If we beat them this time, we might gain control of Canada, or even if we don't gain control of Canada, maybe we can at least get Florida. And then that would secure, everything south of the Great Lakes, east of the Mississippi, in addition to the Louisiana Territory. And we felt that this would end up resolving our Native American issue. Americans were still upset about the British guns being given to Native Americans, which played a major role in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And it also led to more attacks against American settlers out on the frontier. We are still looked at as a second, maybe even a third tier nation at this point. In the grand scheme of things, when you look at England, which had been around more or less close to 1,000 years, same thing with the French, as a kingdom, they had both existed in a one-way shape or form for at least like 800 years, if not a little bit longer, in some cases. The United States at this point had been around for, under the Constitution, the current form of the United States had been around for 23 years. So if we defeated England without French assistance this time, if we defeated England, we would be making a major statement. Again, for whoever finds this on YouTube years down the road, this will mean nothing to you. But for those of you that are watching it now, on December 2nd or close to that, and you're a college basketball fan, University of Kentucky was number 10 in the nation, and they got beat by the unranked Richmond Spiders by 12 points. When the new rankings came out, Kentucky dropped from number 10 to number 20, and Richmond ended up passing them up and becomes, ranked as number 19 in the nation. This would be a huge victory for the United States. It would change the way that the rest of the world looked at us as a nation, possibly even looking at us as a military power. If we lose, it's entirely possible we could go back to being British colonies again. That's the big reason why the War of 1812 is sometimes referred to as the Second War for American Independence. Just gives you an idea here. This is what we're looking at going into the War of 1812. You have the United States and the Indiana Territory, the Louisiana Territory, then Spanish Florida, which Great Britain is going to eventually have control of, British North America, Canada, and, like I said, we're looking at getting control of Canada. Maybe we could gain control of Florida, but we're essentially going to secure this territory from any possible enemies that might pop up. I'll continue on with this when we get into the discussion of the Chapter 12 notes. which I will start in a separate video. And again, folks, if you haven't been doing this already, I don't expect you to sit down and watch these videos for an hour, hour and 20 minutes at a time. I'm just putting them out there. So if you want some further explanation about some of the stuff that's in the notes, it's there for you to listen to. I mean, right now, you know, chapter 10, chapter 11, these videos are probably an hour, or I think chapter 10 was like an hour and a half long. This one's probably close to that. You know, keep in mind, if we were doing these lectures in class, in person, if we weren't having to deal, with COVID, you know, I'm doing a video that's an hour and a half long. I don't expect you to sit through the full hour and a half in one go and watch the whole thing. I'm not expecting you to watch the whole thing as it is. But you have to keep in mind that this very well might end up being a week and a half's worth of lecture in the span of, you know, one video that I post on YouTube. So no, I don't expect you to watch the whole thing at once. And really, if you're just reading through the notes and you see that there's a certain part that you don't really understand what I'm saying in the notes, maybe jump on YouTube, fast forward through the, the timeline on the video, get to the slide that you had a question about, and maybe I'll address the question, or, you know, make a post on the Google Classroom, send me an email, ask for some further explanation. I can either make a smaller video talking specifically about that, or you and I can deal with the question one-on-one. So I'm going to end this video here before long, or possibly tomorrow. I'll end up recording a new video for chapter 12. Once I get that video done, get it posted, that's the last thing that I'm going to do in terms of lecture videos for the rest of the fall semester. And we'll pick up, you know, after Christmas break with post chapter 12 material. So I will see you later.